Okay, everyone, welcome to Mr. Rodriguez's online class. Today we're going to be looking at Pre-AP Unit 2, Lesson 1.2, about finding the poetry in prose. So we're going to start by taking a look at an opening question to get us thinking. But before we get into that, I want to give you a quick reminder of the resources you need for this lesson. You're going to begin by opening up EDSB. There's an assessment on there. It'll be a link to this video, so hopefully you already found that. And there will also be a document with a text that we'll be using later in the activity. So you're going to want to make sure you have those resources. I'm going to be telling you to pause periodically through the video so you can actually work on the different assignments that'll be posted. So let's begin by looking at our opening writing prompt. Even if you cannot read the images on the next two slides, what do you think is prose and which do you think is poetry? What differences do you see between these two writing pieces? That's going to be the first question you're going to answer on the EDSB assessment. So as we look at these two, let's make some quick observations, and then you'll want to pause so that you can answer those questions. So let's start off with Exhibit A. We see that there are not full lines. We see that it's a narrow line of text. If you pay attention to some of the words, you see that it's not written in a style that looks like a paragraph. That's going to be key because this is an example of poetry. Remember, poetry is a specific type of writing. All other writing falls into the category of prose, which we see here in Exhibit B. We see it's broken up into chunks of text. We see long sentences. And so we see this information presented to us in a way that is familiar to most of what we read. So at this time, I'd like you to pause the video real quick, go over to your EDSB assessment, and you can answer that first question so that you can get a good answer in there. So hopefully you're back from pausing the video and we're going to start looking at our next slide. So let's take a second to look at Exhibit A. We're going to read this poem and talk about it for just a second. I'm going to read it aloud to you so you can hear it as you follow along. Predator pored over the bodies of birds, pondering the softness, flesh behind feathers. A single word, bobbing, bobbing, bobbing about in her mind. Predator. What makes this poetic? Well, let's look at that question first. We see the narrow line of text, but we also had some descriptive words and some imagery that's created for us without a lot of words. Remember, poetry is an economy of words, so you're going to be looking for saying the most you could possibly say in the fewest possible words. And this we see as an example of that. Who is the subject of this poem? And how do you know? Well, this should seem familiar. It's from our first 9 weeks of reading, and you'll hopefully realize when we talk about that and we think about the predator that this person was from the red fox fur coat. And we see here in Exhibit B an example of the text. So in this, now look carefully, this is just one sentence from the text. But in this one sentence from the text, they've got a lot of information. So what do you notice about this sentence? Well, some things I'm sure you all are obviously aware of. There are a lot of words in this sentence. There is a lot of punctuation. We see commas and semicolons and colons. So they're combining this information together in a way that gives us a wealth of information. Now, what I'm going to have you guys do is we're going to take a second and draw a line through every word from the prose that the poet omitted. So when they made this poem, they took out some words. So we're going to see that in just a second, but let's look at our next two questions also. So she suddenly became very interested in the animals and found herself leafing through encyclopedias, looking at the pictures, the hedgehog's pale, soft, tender underbelly, and the swift hare of uncertain hue leaping. She pored over the bodies of birds, fascinated, pondering the softness of their flesh behind their feathers, and a single word kept bobbing insistently in her mind: predator. So let's see how it looks without the words that the poet did not use. Wow, that is a lot of words the poet left out. So, what type of words did the poet leave out? For example, why was the word insistently left out? Well, we see almost the entire beginning of this passage is excluded from the poem. Uh, Now, when we think about the word insistently, that's trying to describe this idea of this bobbing, this single word. The word predator is going through her mind over and over. What the author did in the poem is they repeated the word bobbing to imply it is insistent, it is not going away. And if you pay attention to the alignment of those lines, they move them over just a little bit to sort of give you that idea of like something bobbing in water. So this is considered found poetry. Found poetry takes existing texts and refashions them, reorders them, and presents them as poems. It's the literary equivalent of a collage. So what you're seeing here is someone picking out the pieces that they felt could be the most powerful and putting them together in a poem. So let's have a quick conversation where we're going to talk about what is the difference between poetry and prose. So poetry is typically reserved for expressing something special in an artistic way. The language of poetry tends to be more expressive or decorated with comparisons and rhyme and rhythm, contributing to a different sound and feel. Ideas are contained in lines that may or may not be a sentence. The lines are arranged in stanzas. Poetry uses line breaks for various reasons: to follow a formatted rhythm or to emphasize an idea. Lines can run extremely long or be as short as one word or letter. Traditionally, the first letter of every line is capitalized, but many modern poets choose not to follow this rule strictly. And the shape of poetry can also vary depending on line length and the intent of the poet. Now let's switch over to the other side and talk about prose. Prose is most everyday writing is prose. Most of what we see on a daily basis is prose. The language of prose is typically straightforward. There's not as much decoration. Uh, Ideas are contained in sentences that are arranged into paragraphs, and so it's a very similar, familiar format. There are no line breaks, and sentences run right to the margin until the paragraph's completed. The first word of each sentence is capitalized, and prose looks like large blocks of words. So that's just a review of things I'm sure you already know, but I'd like you to pause the video now and go on to questions 2 and 3, where you're going to be identifying some of these characteristics as either belonging to prose or poetry. So that'll be questions 2 and 3. So pause now so that you can move on to the next part of the lesson. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you finished that part. And what we're going to do now is you're going to create your own found poem. So I'm going to go over some of the directions here and give you some do's and don'ts on the next slide. So you're going to reread what happened during the ice storm, underlining and or annotating, or you could highlight if you're using your computer, or you could jot notes down on a sheet of paper. You're going to determine what Virginia Woolf calls delicious language, that shows instead of tells. So you're looking for your telling details here, like we talked about in our first unit way back in August. So now you're going to focus and decide to focus on just one aspect of the narrative. You saw that that last poem came from just one sentence. You don't have to limit yourself to one sentence, but you don't have to try and use the entire story to create your poem. Maybe you'll want to focus on the plight of the pheasants, how it's so unfair what the birds are going through, or how the ice storm is so severe and harsh, or maybe the beauty or suspense between the boy's gesture. Remember, we had some in-depth conversations about whether or not how that ended for the pheasants. Now, you're going to copy the language, the words or phrases and lines that you may want to use in your found poem. You can do this on a fresh sheet of paper. You can leave some plenty of room. You could do this on a computer. You could manage this however works best for you. I know some of you won't like typing on the computer to do your planning stage, so that's fine. Alternatively, you could print it out and cut the words into strips and physically move them around. And if that makes you feel better and you have access to a printer, go ahead. And then you're going to eliminate every word you feel is unnecessary. If it doesn't sound quite right, or if it's distracting from what you want to say in your poem. So here are some suggestions so that you can get the best out of this. And you are not allowed to use your own language. You have to work with the words you found in the story. Uh, but you do have the freedom to repeat language. You can use words or phrases over and over. You can change punctuation or change capitalization. You could use line breaks or spacing of the words or the adjustments of your stanzas. And then read it aloud to yourself. If you have someone at home with you, maybe a younger brother, sister, parent, grandparent, maybe you want to say things out loud so that you can get some feedback on how it's going at the line at pausing at where the line ends and punctuation marks, commas, periods, semicolons. And if something sounds wrong, then fix it, tweak it, adjust the line breaks, play with the punctuation or the spacing, and then give your poem a title. What happened during the ice storm is taken, so that one's not an option. This is going to be the next part of your EDSB assessment, and you're going to create your own found poem that you're going to title based on Jim Heinen's What Happened During the Ice Storm. I have a copy of the poem already posted with your assignment, so that'll be there for you. So if you take a second, pause me now so you can have some time to write your poem. Hopefully those creative juices were flowing and you had a good chance to write a really great poem that you're really proud of. So now I want to take a second and have you reflect on the process. And as you have observed, composing a found poem entails making lots of decisions about what words to cut and what words to keep. While constructing your found poem, what were the pivotal words and phrases you refused to cut? Why were you drawn to those particular words and phrases? Why did you consider them essential? And you're going to be answering these in complete sentences in the next section, in your final section. So, um, what words were non-negotiable? Why were those words non-negotiable? So, for example, for number one, it might be when I was creating my poem, I knew I had to include this phrase. And that's all you're really doing for that answer. So you don't need to make it harder than it seems. And then, same thing, why were those words so important to you? Why were they essential? And you can combine those two into one sentence. So, for number three, what words did you decide to cut? What words? Uh, you're going to cut a lot of words. So I'm going to suggest here picking the ones that felt like a harder choice. What, when you looked at it, maybe you thought this word was going to be good, and when you were writing the poem, you decided, nah, I needed to get rid of it, and this is why. And what other decisions did you make while constructing your poem? How did you decide how many stanzas or what kind of spacing to use? And then this will lead us to our next set of questions. So if you want to pause now, you can go on to the next we'll go on to the next question. Okay, so for your final question for your assignment, it's reflecting on the product. Now, what I want you to look at the poem like a critic. I want you to think about this poem like you're judging it. Uh, does your poem communicate a coherent theme? That was one of our goals in the beginning. Are you talking about the pheasants? Are you talking about the boys? Are you talking about the suspense? Are you talking about the weather? So you're deciding what thing there is the idea you chose. And does the poem contain interesting or vivid language presented in poetic form? What things did you say in a way to be poetic? And does the poem relate well to the content of the original text? How does it fit in with the original story? And you just explain that to me. So for each one of those, you're going to take a few seconds and write a sentence out. The last thing I want you to do is share your poem. Now that you've got a chance to reflect on it, to critique it, read it to a parent, read it to a grandparent, read it to a sibling. I know some of you are probably lacking for some social interaction. Maybe read it to your friend over a FaceTime or um, share it that way, and basically get a chance to express it, because part of poetry is getting to hear it. Now, on your PowerPoint, I also have an example of a found poem for you from what happened during the ice storm, and I have a sample of a reflection. That reflection is much longer than is required in these simple questions, but it gives you a good idea on what this looks like. So you have the PowerPoint, you have the video, and you're going to complete your things here so that you can answer the questions.